Narita Boy basically feels like if someone was looking back at the 80s with the rosiest of colored glasses and made a game based on that recollection. Everything from the sprite work to the screen borders to the tints screams retro, but the game feels distinctly modern, and the end product is one where those two opposing elements are mixed to near perfection. In the landscape of all-time great indie games that have come out in the past decade, some of the most common reoccurring genres or styles are Metroidvanias and synthwave-inspired experiences. So Narita Boy combining these two genres and churning out a winning formula isn't much of a surprise, although that by no means makes the game feel formulaic or derivative. Nor does its transparent goal of constructing a more modernized version of a style made popular decades ago. Incredibly, this game never feels shackled to its inspirations and instead stands out as its own distinct entity. Before I get too far into why I believe this game to be a real indie standout that deserves a lot more attention than it feels like it's gotten currently, I do want to make a couple of quick points. First, if you have Xbox Game Pass, turn the video off and go download this game and just play it. Game Pass members get this game for free, so there is no reason for you to not try this game. If it looks even remotely interesting to you, I'd recommend downloading it and coming to your own conclusion about the quality of the game. Speaking of, the second thing I wanted to mention is the court of public opinion is slightly divided on this game here. Most people seem pretty positive on it, but I've seen a few negative reviews. If we look at the critic scores on Metacritic, the negative reviews point mainly to a slightly disorienting style and one-note exploration and combat, and I'll talk about my personal thoughts on those elements later in the video, but it does seem to be the general consensus among the more negative takes on the game. I bring this up mainly to say this. Know that you will most likely thoroughly enjoy this title, but there is a chance that it doesn't stick with you like it does with other people. In my opinion, however, everyone with at least a moderate interest in the game should try it out because I think there's a good chance it'll strike a chord with you. As a quick side note, do ignore the current user score since there's only a few reviews and only one negative one, and it's just complaining about the keybinds, plus the dude is very clearly a review bomber based on one quick look at his page, so please don't let that throw you off. With that out of the way, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this experience, starting with what is arguably the most consistent and standout element that everyone watching will probably immediately pick up on: the style and presentation. This game oozes style from every pore. When I first wrote that sentence, I physically recoiled at how disgusting it sounded, but I decided to keep it in so you'd have to suffer through the exact same thing I did. The art style is bold and in your face. Enemies are a vivid red, splashes of red, blue, and yellow are all over the place, including as overlays for the entire environment. Your sword is a damn rainbow. You have giant robot dragons, robot horses, and robot people, and the game doesn't shy away from having a personality in its animation. Take a look at the sequence that plays right after you get your sword for the first time. Enemies don't just die, they get sliced, peeled, and dissipated. The death screen is bombastic, and the ethereal beings sound like Bill Wirtz. Hire a samurai. Narita Boy feels like if synthwave music took physical form, even more so in my opinion than games like Ghost Runner, Katana Zero, and Hotline Miami. The environment, sounds, and animations feel drenched in a mixture of 80s sounds and trends with a neon car and a dude wearing red shades, with the chemical X of modern combat and a meta story resulting in this highly styled Metroidvania. And if you think that Powerpuff Girls reference is forced, I'd like to bring up the fact that the villain in this game is called Him, so this is an officially licensed Cartoon Network game in my book. The best compliment I can give Narita Boy's style is that it makes me feel nostalgic for something I never even had. Let me explain. Growing up, my first console was a Wii, and most of the games I had on there were party games. It wasn't until I was 13 and bought a PS3 late in that console's life cycle that games started becoming a big part of my life, so needless to say, Narita Boy doesn't exactly harken back to what I consider my childhood games and Family Game Night or Infamous 2. I have played old games since then, but I have no nostalgia for those titles, which is why the feeling I get from Narita Boy is such a head scratcher. I feel like I'm playing the ideal version of an 80s or 90s console on an old TV. Something about the way they mess with the screen on the sides and they tint everything at all times makes me feel like I'm tunneling into the visuals and I ignore everything around me. Something that doesn't usually happen to me while I'm playing games. There are no frustrating buttons or out of left field controls, no stiff animations, no crappy resolution, and no baffling design choices that you almost always see with old games and old consoles, so playing this game almost feels like you're playing on a memory of old tech that's untainted by the limitations of that technology. It's actually a difficult thing to try and explain, and some people might be saying, wow, this guy must have played like no games if he thinks mixing modern ideas with a retro style is something to be this excited about, but here's my best shot at explaining how this game feels different from the myriad of titles that it could be compared to. Imagine most neo-retro games having this awesome looking black and white background as a canvas on which they then paint a colored foreground over top. Here, the background is analogous to the old school framework of these titles, while the foreground is the more modern mechanics, combats, capabilities, etc. that come with these titles. Usually this ends up with games that look and feel like new games with mere echoes of an older style. On the other hand, Narita Boy feels like if you had the background and foreground as two complete separate things and you crossed your eyes to combine them. You know, like, have you ever taken two bottles or something of the sort that are close together and then crossed your eyes and tried lining the two bottles together? Basically that. That's what playing Narita Boy feels like. It feels so distinctly old and new at the same time, neither one more present or overwhelming than the other, as if you have a foot in two different time periods. This isn't necessarily objectively better than what those other games do. In fact, it might be the very thing that rubs a few people the wrong way, but it is an undeniably unique experience that never stops feeling cool to me. Not only that, but this type of style blends absolutely perfectly with Narita Boy's setting and story. This isn't something I'm going to allocate a huge chunk of time to, but I think it's important to mention because it's kind of the glue that holds the style and presentation together. Essentially, in the world of Narita Boy, someone has created a game called Narita Boy, and it's the best-selling video game of all time. The programming is so sophisticated, though, that it literally interacts with reality, reaching out and zapping the creator's memories. And the game essentially develops rogue code that is trying to overthrow the digital kingdom. Your role is to stop this from happening, and because the game has established sentience and self-awareness of its digital creatures, dialogue, names, objectives, and in-game logic is all self-referential to the fact that this world is all code. The first thing this does is that it establishes a different world, where different games are popular, different consoles exist from our own, and apparently computer magic is a thing. It allows us to essentially believe in the existence of this game in the form that it is, equally retro and futuristic, because maybe in this world, digital art and programming have accelerated much faster than in ours, whereas other technology that dictates console power or resolution has moved slower, allowing for this highly futuristic game to exist in the body of one from 30 years ago. It also makes everything feel like a futuristic digital playground, and something about this art style and the idea that you're almost exploring sophisticated game code meshes so perfectly. In terms of the story itself, it's mainly just jargon that takes place of generic dialogue for a generic story, but it's also so committed to that jargon that it's just fun to experience the dialogue. The game is clearly not trying to have some grand, mind-blowing story, but not everything has to try and do that. Sometimes it's nice to just be goofy and fun with your world, and that's enough, especially when the game doesn't take itself too seriously a lot of the time. Yeah, boy, dance on him. Narita Boy, there has been a terrible tragedy. Oh! I will say, however, that the exception to what I said definitely comes in the 12 to 13 creator memories, which are exactly what they sound like. Memories of the in-game creator of Narita Boy. These sequences are really nice and serene, as well as sad oftentimes, and I find myself paying attention to these quite a bit. It also tied into the main story really nicely at the end, and while I wish they had made just a tiny tweak to the ending, it did culminate in a really cool meta story that, again, wasn't at its core incredibly unique, but the quality came more from how it was packaged than what it actually was. Now, around this point, you're probably looking at your screen and going, hey, wait a minute, it's been 9 minutes, and this dude hasn't even talked about what you do in the game. It's been story and visuals and all that crap, and okay, yeah, fine. Let's get into the gameplay and combat. Let's tackle combat first. Now, this is actually something that a few people have criticized the game for, that its combat is one note and lacks substance. And I'll admit, I do understand where that's coming from. Throughout the game, you slowly gain access to abilities that include an uppercut, a downwards thrush, and a dash strike. And aside from that, you have a basic sword attack, a charged sword attack, a shotgun blast, a light beam that comes out of your face like that robot in the first Thor movie, and a dash and jump for evasion. You also have this mechanic of picking up wildfire abilities, which essentially make you stronger against some enemies that have the same color wildfire on their heads. And you have to juggle these wildfires around in big fights close to the end. Despite these two being very stylistically different games, a lot of this combat reminds me of Guacamelee, another really great indie Metroidvania. In that game, you also slowly collect these extra combat moves that add on to your basic attacks, which are initially pretty limited. The moves you pick up are also color coordinated to some enemy shields. Basically, if an enemy has a shield that's a certain color, you need to use the move that's associated with that color in order to break it and get in some damage, which can be somewhat comparable to the wildfire in Narita Boy. Where they deviate is that Narita Boy's systems are certainly less dynamic than Guacamelé's, which has led to some people claiming that Narita Boy lacks proper substance. In Guacamelee, the powers you use are woven much more seamlessly into your platforming and combat experience. First of all, you have an upgrade tree to maximize your abilities, but even past that, you're able to use an uppercut to send enemies into the air and then perform air combat. You can then use the bash or dash moves in the air to continue that combo, or else dive into the ground with force. A bunch of enemies of all different shield colors can be in the arena, and you have to juggle your abilities on the fly and constantly. Once again, the entire system is dynamic. Narita Boy's combat is not quite as fluid or interconnected. Instead of needing to use wildfire to combat certain colored enemies, it simply does more damage while also making you take more damage, so it's not as essential. It's also just not as fluid of a system as Guacamelé's. To get wildfire, you need to find time to hold the right stick for a couple seconds without being interrupted, and then to change to another wildfire, you need to press the left trigger to cancel your current one, and then hold the right stick in a different direction, which is definitely clunkier than this all-in-one system. Maybe my biggest problem with this combat actually is that it doesn't introduce any type of air combat. There are airborne enemies and you stay suspended in the air for a bit in order to attack them, but it's not air combat. And it really limits the usefulness of the uppercut or downwards thrust, since there's no super practical time to use those things to your advantage except for when you're trying to hit an airborne enemy. But then you can just jump and hit him anyways. Despite all of this, I still really enjoyed Narita Boy's combat, and here's why. Firstly, the actual weight and impact of attacks is great, and that's really important in limited combat systems because even if you're just bashing a single button over and over, there's a higher built-in tolerance for that repetition when bashing the button feels impactful than when it feels like you're waving a twig around. Secondly, the combat feels the same way as I described the style, like it's in two different worlds, essentially the most quintessential way of answering the question, how would an old game feel like if it had more modern sensibilities? You guys ever played the old Castlevania games? Combat in those games is very timing focused in a way that's much different to how modern Metroidvanias or modern games in general are. Things approach you at a certain speed and pitch, and your attack animation is pretty drawn out, so it's all about timing when you hit so that it coincides with when the enemy has entered your attack cone. It's a lot more predictive than the way that most modern Metroidvanias are, where you're just kind of flying off the seat of your pants and reacting to whatever the enemy is throwing at you. Narita Boy takes that old idea and makes a more complete modern system out of its mold. Certain actions take you more time than you'd want and require you to make space for yourself for you to actually pull them off. If you want to charge up your attack and hit someone, you usually have to head off to the side, wait until an enemy is a specific distance away from you, and then start charging it up, because you only get a small amount of time to execute your big charge attack before you get taken out of the animation, which, just like older titles, makes the combat feel more predictive than reactive. It's got a dash button, but you're not flying around acrobatically like you are in Hollow Knight or Ori. It's a stiff dash that's much more methodical and can't be turned into an aerial showcase. Enemies, aside from bosses, have a single move each, which again feels very referential to older games. This combat feels so distinctly old, but it also still feels satisfying and enjoyable. Again, I can't shake the feeling I got from its presentation, that I'm playing the ideal version of an 80s game. And while that might not lead to as sophisticated or well realized of a combat system as its peers, it isn't trying to be that, and its unique take absolutely worked for me. I loved the combat despite its obvious flaws, because those flaws felt like part of a cohesive identity that this game has. You could say the same thing about the platforming. It's incredibly limited here, and it doesn't ask you to do anything all that crazy, but it does fit into that same idea of feeling like it's an older title while still allowing you to have some quality of life elements. Namely that little dash downwards that you can do. It makes the platforming even easier, but I appreciated it given how the platforming that this game is imitating is kind of floaty and hard to control, and this had a built-in way of not feeling as frustrating. While that's the majority of the gameplay side of things, I do have a couple of other miscellaneous doodads that I want to mention that are related to the gameplay. First of all, the game makes sure to occasionally introduce small sections where you're doing something slightly different to the main gameplay loop, and I always appreciate that in a game as long as it's done well. I won't give everything away, but you do get to surf on a floppy disk, ride a robot horse, and turn into a chunky robo boy, all of which are really fun little sections that were nice pace changers. I should mention that one of these sections was actually a main part of the IGN review for this game, which really seemed to make a huge impact on the reviewer. They dedicated a good couple minutes in a 6-minute review to this and called that section at its worst, while also referring to how bad the worst of this game truly was at the beginning of the video. I don't know how much it affected their score, but they did mention how this 2-minute section almost ruined the game for them and how it was the closest they'd ever gotten to rage quitting a game that they had to review. And The section is not very hard. I don't even say that in an "oh, game journalists are bad at games" kind of way, or even a "wow, look how amazing I am" kind of way. This section is just legitimately pretty straightforward and simple to beat. It took me one run to figure out the controls and the health mechanic and how I could hold jump over these bad boys instead of dashing over them, and the next run I beat it. I don't know if they updated this before release, or maybe the reviewer just got in his own head because he seems to be dashing way too much and just seems really turned around. Maybe he was spamming the dash button instead of holding it? I don't know, something seems off. But honestly speaking, this didn't feel much harder than playing 2 minutes of the Dino game. And just to clarify, I've only played that a handful of times, so I'm not like a run and jump master here. I honestly don't know where the problem came from. Or maybe the problem was somehow fixed since then and he just played the pre-fixed version. I don't know, but I will say that from my experience, I had literally no issues here, and I don't know how accurate their mini rant on that section is to the actual finished game. Speaking of difficulty, this is one of those games that has one set difficulty, but don't worry if those type of games often end up feeling too hard for you, because of all the games that have a single difficulty, this is one of the ones that's definitely on the easier side of things. It'll test your abilities and always be difficult enough to feel fun and force you to be engaged, but aside from a couple sections near the end, the only times I died were when I entered combat encounters with really low health to begin with, and since health returns to full once you respawn, I almost never had to do an encounter more than twice. The meh exploration and lack of map is one of the last big criticisms I've seen for this game, and I want to touch on that quickly, if only to say that, yeah, while this isn't a great standout section of the game, I think its overall impact is pretty limited. I didn't feel myself getting lost or confused too often because, similar to Carry On, most of the time you were in pockets of the map and exploring a small area, and then were taken out of that pocket and placed in a new one. And actually in this game it's way easier to figure out where you are than it is in Carry On, because all of the sections in Carry On look kind of the same, but here they look at least a little bit distinct from one another. The only time it gets really confusing is when you're in one section and then you go inside of another section for like an hour, and then you leave that section and you completely forget the layout of the outside layer, but still, it only ever took me a couple minutes to figure out where I was. The exploration is pretty basic because the game is somewhat linear, and I think it would have been better if they tried to treat areas linearly too, because it would have just fit better. Instead of having 5 areas that you want access to and you have to go here to get the key to here, to get the key to here, to get the key to here, and then you come all the way back here. But again, I just didn't find this to be too big of a part of the overall picture, so it didn't bother me too much. It is probably the weakest overall aspect of the game, however. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't touch on the soundtrack. I'm no music critic over here, but this game's soundtrack is a synthwave dream. It is techno as hell, and the main theme is unfairly catchy. Dude, the action scene where you get put in the middle of a rock concert, you can't tell me that isn't baller as hell. Even if you never played this game, please, for the love of God, check out the soundtrack, because from everything I've heard, this is a perfectly crafted backdrop for this style of game. Narita Boy is the video game equivalent of a Gen Z kid with an old soul, or that one guy from 30 Rock trying to see what's up with his fellow kids. To some people, it might feel like a modern game that lacks substance, but I saw it as an old game that was incredibly stylistic and fleshed out. The game almost felt like a memory as I played it, and that uniquely authentic old school style is what sold the game for me. While it isn't a game for everyone, it is one that I believe everyone should try, because it has the potential to really resonate with people and become a cult classic that we refer back to in 10 years as one of the decade's most underrated games. I wish Studio Koba all the best with this game and all of their future projects, and I hope the game starts gaining more traction the more people talk about it. I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of analysis slash review of Narita Boy. If you did and you're new here, consider subscribing to help grow the channel. It's super small right now, but that just means that every subscription helps. If you're interested in other indie games, I already have a few of those up on the channel, and I'm currently working on a 5 cents review for Genesis Noir. So go check that out and keep an eye out for that next one, and I'll see you guys then. Peace.